I begin by asking the question, why is the story of Hannah so important? Why is this story, it's a very interesting story, in the Bible at all? And Hannah, as Stephen told us, is the mother of Samuel. And we don't think of Samuel in that great kind of panoply of heroes and sheroes in the Jewish and human family, but Samuel is up there. And he is part of our Jewish Christian family album. And he moves our ancestors in ancient Israel from a tribal confederacy that could easily be overtaken by the military prowess of outside nations. He moves them from this kind of fragmented tribal confederacy into a kingdom, into a nation. And history has changed. The German theologian Gunther has pointed out, history and legend bring Samuel forward in all the roles which were possible for an outstanding man of those times, as a seer, a Nazarite, a kind of monk, a priest, a judge, and a prophet. A clear proof that in the time between Moses and the monarchy, no man was known of equal importance for Israel. Now, we have just spent a lot of time and money in this country on an election, right? Seems so long ago, but it was a very important moment in the connection between government and the governed. And there is really deep appreciation, and I bring it up today because it's part of the lectionary, but Samuel in some ways contributed to that contribution of the importance of listening by leadership to the governed and making changes difficult and maybe not exactly what he wanted to hear. The Samuel story is all about that. And so we owe him credit for introducing to humankind a sense of nation building and leadership, kingship, that was about listening differently. There's another Old Testament scholar, T.H. Robinson, who says that Israel, the one genuine Palestinian nation of ancient times, must receive the credit for one of the greatest contributions ever made to the political thought of man. She brought with her from the nomad stage a conception of common brotherhood, which she was the first to apply to the conditions of a highly organized, settled community. Except in her concept of religion, Israel had no greater gift to offer the world as this, a truly democratic theory of the relation between the government and the governed. And there's a little background I want to tell you, because this story is in this kind of domestic, there's a little rivalry going on between the two wives, but the setting is this beautiful kind of intimate family, domestic situation. But if you read the book just before the book of Samuel, it is, again, the importance of this story comes out when we understand the context in which this conversation is going on between this family. And Israel at the time, the confederacy had broken apart. The tribes were all fighting each other. Imagine Iraq or Afghanistan in recent years, where the tribal lords and the militias had taken over, and there was murder and violence. The place was not safe. And there was one particular story that really hit people hard about how awful it was. And the story is an Ephraimite is visiting another tribe, the Benjaminites, and he brings his concubine, his wife. And the Middle Eastern, the real importance of hospitality, that you're safe, you're treated, that was completely desecrated. And the wife of this man is raped by the local man and dies. And she dies in front of her husband. And he is so furious that he does something really bizarre. He cuts up her body and he sends pieces to the other tribes to show how degraded society had become. And the tribes rise up against the tribe of Benjamin. And the tribe of Benjamin is almost destroyed. That's the context of this story. It's this story of this intimate conversation between a man who loves two women differently. And as a tribal leader, Elkanah would have been concerned about how the tribe survived. So one of his wives her job was to produce children. And then this other wife, he loved differently. He gave her the double portion. And in this beautiful, intimate, domestic, conflicted situation, we have the first intimate conversation of an Israelite man to an Israelite woman. Darling, am I not more important to you than 10 sons? And she is obviously victimized by the other wife, who has 4 sons. And biblical marriage is obsessed with reproduction, especially the sons that will become warriors. So there's this, in this ménage à trois, we have these first tender words ever spoken between a man and a woman in the Bible. And so Hannah goes off to visit the local shrine at Shiloh, where Eli is the custodian. And it's interesting, with all that violence and desecration, nothing is sacred in the land, and so he thinks this woman who's coming in to pray is drunk. Nothing is respected. But she's praying, she's pouring out her soul. And he hears the prayer, and the prayer is, she's praying to the Lord of hosts. And who is the Lord of hosts? The Lord of hosts is the God of war. She's praying to the warrior God. And it's interesting, she's praying for fertility, but she's praying to the warrior God. And the priest Eli becomes, it's interesting, Eli overhears this, and Eli becomes kind of connected to this moment. And it's rather like Eli is like a kind of Joseph figure, if you think of Joseph and Mary, that he becomes the kind of mentor and father of this child that is yet to be born, this child who will change history. And his own sons are deadbeats. It's interesting. And that his life and the life of Israel and the life of the world is about to be transformed in this kind of annunciation that's going on. And he says to her, go in peace. All the angst, all the bitterness, all the stuff that's holding her back, and she goes home. And it says Elkanah has sex with, they go to bed, and she gets pregnant. Kind of good pastoral counseling. Go in peace. And she gives birth to Samuel. And I think it's a pretty amazing story. We don't know this story very well, but it really is an amazing story. And Samuel is up there because he then becomes this kind of custodian of the shrine. Shiloh becomes the religious center of this confederacy that he begins to pull together, and he listens to the people, and they desperately want a change of government. They want to survive, and the way they do that, they want a monarchy. And he's not sure a monarchy is going to work. So even though he's listening, doesn't agree with what he's hearing, but he gives them what they want. And so Samuel becomes a kind of prototype of leadership. Whether you're the vicar or the vestry or the government, you have to listen to your people. And you have to give them what they want, even though that might be what you don't want. And so Samuel is this kind of great reconciler and nation builder. And as I was thinking about him, and who might we look in the world today who's done that in our lifetime? And I think of Nelson Mandela. Nelson Mandela. And to think that for 18 of the 27 years he was denied his freedom. He was in this little prison cell, Robben Island. I heard a sermon one time. There was lots of connections between All Saints Pasadena and South Africa as they were kind of really dismembering apartheid. And Desmond Tutu would come over and so on. And I remember the rector, Ed Braken, preached a sermon one time of kind of the mystery of God. Who would have thought that in the midst of all this violence and degradation, human separation and violence, that God was preparing a man in a little cell on Robben Island who was going to transform the world and bring together that new emerging nation. And he takes humanity in a different direction. And Samuel is like this. I want to quote a little bit of what inspired, what Mandela comes out of that captivity thinking. I am fundamentally an optimist. Whether that comes from nature or nurture, I cannot say. Part of being optimistic is keeping one's head pointed towards the sun, one's feet moving forward. There were many dark moments when my faith in humanity was sorely tested. I would not and could not give myself up to despair. That way lays defeat and death. I learned that courage was not the absence of fear, but the triumph over it. The brave man is not he who does not feel afraid, but he who conquers that fear. So Hannah possesses the same qualities that we have come to appreciate in leaders like Mandela. And like Samuel, Mandela's wise counsel came from bitter experience and years of frustration. And he could have emerged from that prison cell full of revenge and broken, but instead he found an interior freedom to proclaim a different way of being and relating to the world. He talked about resentment. Resentment is like drinking poison and then hoping it will kill your enemy. So I want to connect this model of courageous leadership and the call to bind up and draw a divided community together that the stories of Hannah and Samuel and Nelson invite us to look at today as we celebrate Thanksgiving, right? We're about to gather at our tables and in all its complexity of our families and our neighbors and our friends and, the Uncle Fred and all the political comments that we want to avoid. And it is actually a wonderful opportunity to listen, to do what Samuel did so well, to listen. And as a nation, we must chart our course with the political and economic decisions that we are making, divided as we are. And like Hannah, it's easy to become resentful and bitter when we don't get what we want. It is easier to blame the other or demonize the opposition when our religion, if it is to be of any help to us in the present day, to simply remain faithful to God and his vision for the world we are called to co-create, our religion teaches us something different. And this partnership between us and God and us and our neighbor is vital. It is part of our biblical heritage that we don't always get what we want, but God is slow but sure. And who knows what God is hiding in some unlikely dark corner? I think about those families trying to get into this country. And I often think about, like Mandela, in that longing and that kind of advent, looking for something better, and in that suffering and difficulty, who knows what God is forging in individuals that will transform this country and this world? There is a great economy in God. Nothing is wasted, even in the suffering. And in Mark's Gospel, we're about to end our journey with Mark's Gospel, but there's a kind of minor apocalyptic whiff in the air as we conclude this journey with Jesus. And it was written when the temple was actually destroyed. The temple that they're talking about was actually gone, destroyed and burned by imperial Rome, and Jewish life was never to be the same again. And the image is an unsettling one because it's about the things that we love and are stable and beautiful, architecture, that all of that is up for grabs. It's all transient. And we have to ask ourselves the question, what are the deeper values that endure? Not this stuff that passes, the impermanent. And it's hard for us to believe and to accept. Just as Samuel changed the course of Israel's identity and government, so Jesus would change the way his followers would think about themselves and their relations with each other and with the mystery we call God. So we have these icons of human potential who are predestined to make the world a better place. And it's not a place of perfection, but it's coming from a place of violence and suffering and lots of unanswered questions. And yet they somehow create a path through the darkness and confusion that we are still intrigued by. So I offer some thoughts as we gather around the Thanksgiving table. And it's a kind of a new beginnings. You know, a couple of Sundays, it'll be the beginning of a new church year. Advent is a new beginning. And we begin a new calendar year in January. And as I was thinking about what does this mean in post-election, I was taken back to 2009 to an interesting experience of, after working on Proposition 8, which was the marriage equality, the first time we fought for marriage equality in California, it was defeated. And it was defeated by pretty ruthless campaigns of misinformation, and it was a really dirty business. And the religious community was deeply involved in that misinformation. And so in San Diego, we invited the community that was feeling like Hannah, bitter, disappointed, unequal. They were invited to the cathedral for a service, what was called an interfaith service of consolation and determination. And many of us had worked hard for years to have the same access to marriage as other citizens, and it was again denied to us in this brutal and dishonest campaign. So we all arrived in the cathedral with all this baggage, right? It was just like Hannah. And we were all disappointed. The place was packed, and I was preaching. And the text was 1 Corinthians 13, the hymn to love. And I found a really helpful book by a professor, evangelical seminary professor called David Augsburger. And the book was called Hate Work. Hate Work, Working Through the Pleasure and Pain of Hate. And the book became a kind of helpful warning light on my own dashboard of what was happening to us. And we are seduced to demonize or to be demonized. And I've just recently went back and kind of reread part of that book. In the light, I mean, this is only 10 years ago, and you think of what the country, we are addicted to hate in this country. We have to blame somebody. And the divisions are really, really deep. And I'm finding the same message applies to what we're dealing with in our country today, in our world today. This is what Augsburger says. We can fall in hate just like we can fall in love. Falling in hate is the rush of negative feelings seizing control of the mind in a response to an absolute. All good is split away from the bad, and the bad may be hated without reservation. We have seen the enemy's face, and it is all we have loathed. What a relief from self-doubt to find a scapegoat, someone to blame, someone to bear the weight of our rage, the burden of our bad conscience. And Augsburger quotes Carl Jung. Carl Jung has a very interesting take on hate, and hate within the economy of God. And he uses the example of St. Paul as an example that hate is something that even can be used by God for good. And he talks about St. Paul. Saul owned his conversion neither to true love nor to true faith, nor to any other truth. It was solely his hatred of Christians that set him on the road to Damascus, and to that decisive experience which was to decide the whole course of his life. He was brought to this experience by following with conviction the course in which he was most completely mistaken. The irony in all of this is that even persecution does not destroy love, and that God often uses the paths and the tools of the haters to make the circle of fugitives and rejects much wider. Augsburger wrote this book in 2004. And there's a wonderful kind of breakdown. He describes demonizing one's adversary has great costs, however. When a leader weighs the merits and demerits of a situation, finds 52% positive versus 48% negative, and yet chooses to demonize the conflict to 100% good versus 100% evil, the polarization blinds us. When looking at the 52% devil, we cannot see the 48% ally. Demonizing blocks the possibility of discovering how we might be allied with the adversary if we move beyond an either-or mentality, or a both-and, or a creative neither-nor approach. And it's interesting reading that stuff that spoke to us and gave us some kind of something to work on besides our own desperation. It's interesting applying that idea to where the country is today. You know? I never thought we would be in this place as a country. And Augsburger's message is very profound. And he concludes his book by saying that the great work of the church in the 21st century, not only mainstream denominations, but places like Fuller Seminary and the evangelical world, that is still to come to grips with who we are and what we're contributing to the work of God in the world. He says this: the ultimate religious question of the 21st century is, how can we find God in our enemy? Think about that. How can we find God in our enemy? And this is the Jesus whose teaching on nonviolence and love of enemies is the truth most relevant to our century. There is, in fact, no other way to God for our time but through the enemy. For loving the enemy has become key both to human survival in the nuclear age and to personal transformation. It's a wonderful idea. Almost a decade ago. And again, I ask myself, what changes and what remains constant? And I never thought the issue of division and hate and demonizing would fester into what we see and experience today. The institutions we trusted, admired, and took for granted are being taken apart like the stones of the temple before our very eyes. So these are not easy times, though the country and the world have lived through much worse times. But the work of reconciliation and being aware of what we are now caught up in and how to fix it, that Samuel and Hannah can be kind of lights to show the way. So this Thanksgiving, let us begin around the table as we enter a new church year, the first Sunday of Advent, and as we enter a new calendar year. And let us think and pray about what we all can do in listening and in bringing about this new day. Amen.